The Crusading era was one of the most important periods in medieval history, affecting many aspects of European culture. During this period, many prominent personalities stood out and recorded their names in history. Among them, King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, also called Baldwin the Leper for the illness that afflicted his body throughout most of his short life, certainly deserves recognition for his efforts in defending the Holy Land. Baldwin was born in 1161 in Jerusalem. He was the second son of Prince Amalric of Jerusalem and the younger brother of King Baldwin III. When he was 9 years old, Baldwin was brought up by the historian William of Tyre. His tutor was the one who discovered that the young boy was suffering from leprosy. Unlike other children, Baldwin did not cry when he was pinched by his classmates. After a while, it became clear to William that Baldwin felt no pain in his right arm. The king commissioned Muslim physicians to treat Baldwin, but nothing was enough to quell the illness. Leprosy was suspected, but there were no visible symptoms yet, and the doctors were reluctant to diagnose because of the terrifying stigma the boy would suffer. Had the diagnosis been made when he was a child, Baldwin would have been required by law to enter the Order of St. Lazarus, a military order made up of knights who were lepers or victims of other diseases. Initially, Baldwin continued to use his limbs and had no noticeable facial disfigurement, but his illness was kept a secret. As a teenager, Baldwin was an optimistic and determined young man when faced with his condition. He was very similar to his father in appearance, body shape, and the way he walked and spoke. Baldwin learned fast, but sometimes stuttered. He enjoyed listening to stories and history lessons. William, his tutor, commented on Baldwin's superb memory, claiming that he did not forget the kindness or the offenses done to him by others. In 1174, Baldwin's father unexpectedly died of dysentery upon his return from a campaign against Nur ad-Din, the Sultan of Damascus. Baldwin was appointed king by the Supreme Court of Jerusalem. As Baldwin was only 13 years old at the time of his father's death, the kingdom was entrusted to a regent named Raymond of Tripoli. In the summer of 1176, Baldwin turned 15 and came of age, taking the government for himself. Due to his health condition, no one expected Baldwin to stay long in power or to have heirs. His illness dictated much of his reign, as he always had to worry about the issue of succession. Baldwin had planned to marry his sister, Sibylla, to Hugh III of Burgundy, but ended up marrying her to a French noble knight named Guy of Lusignan. The union was crucial to win military aid for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Once he took over the government, Baldwin commenced planning a full-scale attack on Egypt. The king took advantage of Saladin's campaign in Aleppo to spearhead an attack around Damascus. It was his first war experience. Despite having already lost almost all movement of his limbs and having the use of only one hand, he declined to delegate his military duties and entered the fighting. In November 1177, Sultan Saladin left Egypt to attack the city of Ashkelon. Baldwin, then 16 years old, commanded the Frankish army and rode towards Ashkelon to save the city. The Frankish army was considerably outnumbered compared to the Muslim army. Saladin kept on his march toward Jerusalem, figuring that Baldwin would not dare to follow him with so few men. Saladin enabled his army to spread out over a large area, plundering and ravaging villages. Meanwhile, Baldwin and the Knights Templar managed to break through the Muslim blockades. Baldwin chased Saladin until nightfall, and then retreated to Ashkelon. Experiencing the loss of nearly 90% of his army, including his own personal guard of Mamluks, Saladin fled back to Egypt, assaulted by desert Bedouins on the way. Barely a tenth of his army made it back to Egypt with him. The aftermath for Baldwin, however, was also disastrous. He was in puberty when he launched his daring campaign against Saladin. It was probably partly because of this campaign, which required camping in the countryside and spending days without the usual foot and hand baths, that made Baldwin's leprosy deteriorate. The disease unavoidably ran its course, Through the horrific stages of increasing disability and facial disfigurement, Baldwin was gradually paralyzed and had to be carried on a litter hung between two knights' horses. His blindness came soon after. Intellectually sharp, but mindful of his physical shortcomings, he proposed to abdicate the throne. However, in honor of his leadership, this was overruled by the noblemen. By 1183, Baldwin was feverish and, thinking he was on his deathbed, named his brother-in-law, Guy of Lusignan, as regent. When Saladin attacked again, Guy of Lusignan led the Christian armies to confront him. Baldwin had no children due to leprosy, so he appointed his 5-year-old nephew, Baldwin V, the child king, as his successor. On March 16, 1185, at 23 years old, Baldwin IV died, at last finding peace after spending a lifetime in agony from his illness. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, near his father, King Amalric. Despite all of his difficulties, Baldwin managed to defy all odds and ruled Jerusalem for almost 11 years, keeping the loyalty of his subjects to the very end. He prevented the immensely superior forces of Saladin from dominating his kingdom on 5 occasions. Notwithstanding his illness, Baldwin IV is considered one of Jerusalem's most accomplished kings.
Saladin was the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty. He was also the first sultan of Egypt and Syria, and the man who united the Muslim world against the European crusading forces. He is considered one of Islam's greatest heroes, noted for his leadership and military prowess. He is also respected for his chivalrous and sometimes merciful nature during the war against the Crusaders. Saladin was the son of a high-ranking Kurdish officer who had served in the military of Nur al-Din, the ruler of a Syrian province then under the control of the Seljuk Empire. Born in 1138 in Tikrit, Iraq, Saladin was Arabic culturally, linguistically, and religiously. Originally, Saladin was given the name YUSUF ibn Ayyub. Later, he took the name Salah al-Din, which was westernized to Saladin, meaning the righteousness of faith. There are not many accounts of Saladin's childhood and youth. He seems to have been well educated as a young man, although he was more of a scholar than a warrior. After growing up in the city of Damascus and rising through the military ranks, young Saladin joined an army commanded by his uncle and took part in a military expedition in Egypt to prevent Crusader control of land. It was there that Saladin saw his first battles. Saladin's uncle died 2 months later. In March 1169, Saladin, age 31, was chosen to succeed him in command of Nur al-Din's forces in Egypt. He was also appointed vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, which ruled Egypt at the time. Upon the death of the last Fatimid Caliph in 1171, Saladin became governor of Egypt and started to reduce the power and influence of Shiite Islam by re-establishing a Sunni regime. For the next 18 years, Saladin secured his total authority over Egypt. As time passed, his 2 main rivals, King Amalric of Jerusalem and his former suzerain, Nur al-Din, died. Saladin invaded and conquered Syria in 1174 and was proclaimed Sultan of Egypt and Syria. This title would be bestowed on him for the rest of his life, also founding a new Islamic dynasty that would rule most of Western Asia for the next century. But not all went well during Saladin's rise. He fostered the enmity of many Muslim leaders, and there were even plots against his life. On May 11, 1175, 13 assassins managed to infiltrate Saladin's camp. The invaders were part of the dreaded Order of Assassins, an Ishmaelite sect of Shiites who lived in the mountains of Persia and Syria. But the invaders were promptly discovered. One of them was killed by one of Saladin's generals. The others were put to death while trying to escape. The following year, there was another assassination attempt. Saladin survived thanks to his armor, which protected him from a dagger aimed at his heart. Initially, Saladin responded to these attacks by besieging the city of Masyaf, where he believed the assassins' hideout to be. Later, Saladin sought to form an alliance with Rashid Sinan, the leader of the assassins, also known as the Old Man of the Mountain. Saladin and Sinan considered the expulsion of the Crusaders a mutual benefit. Therefore, they maintained cooperative military relations. From the year 1174, King Baldwin IV ruled Jerusalem. Despite suffering through his life a terrible leprosy infection, he was considered an effective leader. Saladin and Baldwin faced each other at the Battle of Montesgard, where Baldwin, at the age of only 16, won a surprising victory. The truce was maintained between the two leaders for some time since then, but the brave King Baldwin IV succumbed to illness. After his death in 1185, the throne of Jerusalem passed to his sister Sibylla, who in turn crowned her husband Guy of Lusignan as king. In 1186, the treacherous knight Renaud of Chatillon, an ally of the Knights Templar in the service of Guy and Sibylla, decided to attack a large Muslim caravan traveling through the desert when the truce with Saladin was still in effect. For Saladin, this provocation was unforgivable, and the war against the Crusaders resumed. Saladin prepared to launch a full-scale attack in 1187, gathering troops from his entire kingdom south of Damascus and an impressive Egyptian fleet at Alexandria. The dispute was decided at the famous Battle of Hattin. The Crusader army was largely annihilated by Saladin's motivated troops. It was a huge disaster for the Crusaders and a turning point in the history of the Crusades. Saladin captured Renaud de Chatillon, the causer of that new wave of violence. According to historical records, Saladin personally executed Renaud de Chatillon. Guy of Lusignan was also captured, but his life was spared. On October 2, 1187, the city of Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin's army after 88 years of Christian control. Although Saladin had planned to kill all the Christians in Jerusalem as revenge for the massacre of Muslims in 1099, he agreed to let them buy their freedom. After Saladin captured Jerusalem, Pope Gregory III called for a new crusade to recapture the city. In 1189, Christian forces mobilized in the city of Tyre to begin the Third Crusade, led by 3 European kings: Frederick Barbarossa, the German king and emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, King Philip II of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. 3 years of battles and sieges followed, led mainly by King Richard the Lionheart. Richard's forces faced Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf in 1181 and at the Battle of Jaffa in 1192. The rivalry and mutual respect between Saladin and Richard became legendary. Both were celebrated in poems and courtly tales. When Richard was wounded in battle, Saladin offered the services of his personal physician to help him. At Arsuf, when Richard lost his battle horse, Saladin sent him 2 Arabian thoroughbred stallions as replacements. Saladin also sent him fresh fruit and snow to keep his drinks cold. For his part, Richard suggested to Saladin the marriage between the Englishman's sister and the Arab's brother, and Jerusalem would be the wedding gift. The two reached an agreement about Jerusalem in the Treaty of Ramla in 1192. The city would remain under Muslim control, but would be open to pilgrimages by unarmed Christians. However, the several years of battles and constant pressure of having to lead the holy war against the Crusaders began to affect Saladin's health. By early 1193, he was suffering from severe fatigue. Fever and illness caused him to be under constant attention from doctors. A few months later, in March 1193, Saladin died peacefully in bed in his royal palace in Damascus. Saladin passed away relatively young, around the age of 56. At the time of his death, he had donated much of his personal wealth to subjects and charities, leaving in the royal treasury an insufficient amount to pay for his funeral. The coalition of Muslim states assembled by Saladin broke up after his death, but his descendants in the Ayyubid dynasty continued to rule Egypt and Syria for several generations. The English king, Richard I, more commonly known by the honorific epithet of Richard the Lionheart, was one of the most famous kings in history. His courage, military capabilities, and attractive personality made Richard I an almost legendary figure, considered by many to be the best king of England during the medieval period. Nevertheless, there are questions about the life of Richard the Lionheart. Some claim that he was not actually born in England and could not even speak the English language, while others point to him as an unreliable king who almost emptied the English coffers while spending most of his reign fighting in foreign countries. The truth is that Richard I was born in England on September 8, 1157, most likely at Beaumont Palace in Oxford. He was the fourth son of King Henry II of England and his wife, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Richard's education encompassed the study of medieval chivalric literature. Poetry was another favorite pastime of the young prince, who authored his own poems in French. As a teenager, Richard was a tall boy with blue eyes and reddish blonde hair who was already known for his courage. When Richard was about 12 years old, his parents turned out to be open enemies. King Henry II took the beautiful Rosamund Clifford as his mistress, and people said that he really loved her, which deeply hurt Queen Eleanor. The neglected queen returned to her homeland in Aquitaine, a historic duchy in France and part of Spain, establishing her own court there and taking Richard with her, who was named as her heir. Emboldened by his mother, Richard and his brothers turned against their own father, which led to some battles in France. Richard had an alliance with Philip II, the new King of France. King Henry II, Richard's father, was vanquished in a battle and had to surrender. Richard I became King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou. His coronation was held at Westminster Abbey on September 3, 1189. Of a particular interest, a bat was seen flying near the king's head during the coronation ceremony. This was seen by many onlookers that day as a dark omen. On hearing the news of Jerusalem being taken by the Muslims, Pope Gregory VIII took it upon himself to call for another crusade to retake the Holy Land for Christianity. Richard instantly declared his crusade vows, pledging to defend the Holy Land. He was the first Northern European monarch to take his vows and was soon followed by Philip II of France. Yet, due to ongoing family feuds and conflicts near the end of his father's reign, Richard did not set out for the Holy Land until 1190. As young men, Richard I and Philip II became extremely close friends, leading to rumors about the nature of their relationship. The two shared a bed on a few occasions, but it is believed this was a political gesture to prove the trust between the two, a relatively widespread practice in the Middle Ages. Richard and Philip went on the Third Crusade together, but it was not only because of the friendship between the two monarchs. This was largely because they were both suspicious of each other, afraid that their peer would usurp their territories while abroad. Richard, who had not been seen on English soil since childhood, emptied his kingdom's coffers for his mission. He even made an arrangement with William I, King of Scotland, giving him full feudal autonomy in exchange for money. For a monarch who spent most of his reign outside of England, he could barely speak English, and who imprudently sent the kingdom's wealth on foreign campaigns, Richard was oddly admired by his contemporary subjects. The English contingent arrived at the city of Acre in the Holy Land in 1191, but Richard the Lionheart's reputation apparently preceded him. On July the 11th, the Muslim defenders handed the city back to the Christian army. Richard I, Philip II, and Leopold V of Austria, leader of the German Crusade contingent, disagreed over the allocation of their victory spoils. During the argument, Richard insulted Leopold, an action that would have dreadful consequences for him in the future. The Christian army started to rebuild the city of Acre, while Saladin collected funds to pay the prisoners' ransoms. However, Richard grew impatient while waiting for Saladin to pay the full ransom amount and execute 2,700 Muslim prisoners. As a result, Saladin executed all the Christian prisoners in his camp. This tragedy is known as the Massacre of AYYUB. Following this, the Crusader army marched south, and Saladin's army followed. They finally met in the well-known Battle of Arsurf on September 7, 1191. The Crusader victory at Arsurf was pivotal to the fall of Jaffa 2 months later. Notwithstanding his efforts, Richard was ultimately unsuccessful in capturing Jerusalem. It was at this time that he was notified that his younger brother, John, was trying to usurp his throne in England. Although the battles were brutal, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin developed a mutual respect. The two leaders sent letters and gifts back and forth, and repeatedly sought to agree on the terms of a peace treaty. Finally, Richard reached a treaty with Saladin, in which the city of Jerusalem would continue under Muslim rule, but would be open to unarmed Christian pilgrims. Therefore, the Third Crusade officially ended on October 9, 1192, when Richard sailed back to England. However, Richard's journey was interrupted when his ship sank, and he was taken prisoner by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom Richard had harshly insulted at the beginning of the Third Crusade. Richard was locked up in Dürnstein Castle in Lower Austria, and England was forced to pay a hefty ransom to free him. Richard was then transferred as a prisoner to Henry VI, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and held captive at Trifles Castle in Germany until he was released in February 1194. While still captive, Richard's younger brother, John, plotted with Philip II of France in an unsuccessful attempt to take the English throne. The resulting war between the two siblings was primarily a matter of sieges and controlling strategically important castles such as Nottingham and Windsor Castle. But John was ultimately defeated. Richard forgave his brother for his inflated ambition and even appointed him as successor to smooth things over in England. After a brief time in England, Richard spent much of his time on military campaign in France, defending his lands against his former ally, King Philip II of France. The two became estranged when Richard refused to marry Philip's sister, even though they had been betrothed for 20 years. Meanwhile, Richard had married Berengaria of Navarra, a marriage arrangement made by Richard's mother. Berengaria would become the only reigning English queen to never set foot in her own kingdom. In March 1199, Richard the Lionheart was in Limousin, in west-central France, attempting to suppress a revolt by Viscount Aymar V of Limoges. Richard laid siege to Château de Jaloux-Jabrol, but the worst was yet to come. On March the 26th, Richard was shot in the shoulder by an arrow fired from a crossbow. According to reports, in the heat of battle, Richard tried to pull the arrow out with his bare hands, but it broke off, exposing the iron points inside the wound, which grew infected and gangrenous. On April the 6th, 1199, Richard the Lionheart died at age 41, while in the arms of his mother, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. After his death, myths about Richard I continued to spread. His bold actions and the deference of soldiers to him were praised by many contemporary writers. Having already shown his bravery as a determined enemy of the Saracens and defender of Christianity, as well as a poet, Richard was the highly idealized model of the medieval knight. Despite his excessive spending, Richard defended his kingdom and territories, and, before his death, recovered some of the English wealth by promoting jousting tournaments. Throughout his reign, Richard the Lionheart spent few months in England, and much of his life was spent on the battlefields and alongside soldiers. But his name is still celebrated as one of England's finest kings, and his life story continues to serve as an inspiration to this day.